Alex, okay, welcome. I would like to welcome you to our crossing number 8, the Wheel of Fortune. And we are lucky, so to speak, to have Metahaven with us and Flaka Haliti for tonight's conversation. Different to what we announced, Markus Miesen unfortunately cannot be here with us tonight. So, crossing number 8, the Wheel of Fortune, the making of the discourse bar. This is basically the space we are in right now, or we inhabit together. Is part of the public program, The Fortress of Cross Destinies, curated by our dear friend and long-term collaborator Marina Foukidis, who's also here with us and will join the discussion later. So I would like first to introduce Flaka, Haliti, and Metahaven, and then we decided that both Metahaven in the person of Daniel van der Velden will shortly, Daniel and Flaka will shortly introduce some of their works that are related to this space, because this space basically followed an invitation from Flaka, which basically we invited to create a discursive space here as part of our activities during the summer. And she gave that invitation to Metahaven and then later also to Markus Miesen to develop this space here. And I think we will talk about this later onwards. So first, I would like to introduce Metahaven. The work of the Amsterdam-based artist collective Metahaven consists of filmmaking, writing, and design. Since 2007, the work of Metahaven, Winzer Krug, and Daniel van der Velden has extended from graphic identities, spatial installations, and publications to garments and music videos. In recent years, Metahaven have turned predominantly to the moving image, drawing on investigative and speculative methods as part of their design work. Their films have integrated diverse forms of documentary and fiction, essay film, and poetry. Welcome, Daniel. And then, so Flaka is basically the second year here with us, and I would like to point that out. So she's teaching this year, where is it? Now I'm confused with my notes. Okay, here we are. The course Spatial Negativity and Hijacks Through Hybrid Materiality. And last year she was teaching the course Spatial Hijacks by Sculpture. And I think we also will come back to that, as the recent course also relates a little bit to some ideas here in the space. Flaka's artistic practice includes mixed media, sculpture, and spatial installation with a decidedly site-specific approach. Appropriation and rearrangement are continuous lines in her works, whereby new aesthetics patterns are created. Haliti emphasizes altered perceptions on visual level as well as in conceptual methods to engage in political reflection and geopolitical preoccupations. Mediated by the sensory and by visual fields, territorial boundaries and powers, such as national borders or the dispositions of associations like the UN or the European Union, are brought to negotiation. Importantly, her works steadily confront the languages of identity construction in order to be transcend its categorizations of gender or nationality, while introducing detour as a game plan of resistance. And I think something around the question of categorization is something that kind of was very much part of this invitation and conversation we had in kind of creating this space here. And with that, I would like to give the microphone to Daniel. And again, welcome also to those who joined us online.
Thank you so much, Sophie. It's really great to be here. I arrived to Salzburg yesterday pretty late, and now today here with you and tomorrow somewhere else. But I mean, I hope you're having a great time in the Summer Academy for those who are in it right now. And I think it would be good to start from our perspective. So as Sophie said, Winka Kruk and myself founded Metahaven, and we originally come from a sort of experimental graphic design background. But we've moved much more into, you know, several different media. Storytelling and narrative were always a big part of what we did. And we found that moving image in particular fitted that sort of really well, at least for the time being. So what I want to talk about is to sort of like explain a little bit like these two works that are here, which are called Living Together in Stories, that were made on the incentive of this show, but also connect them a little bit to other works we've done. You know, not all the works are big. Some of them are incredibly small. Some are embroideries, other are jacquard weavings. And the reason I want to do that is not so much emphasize only the medium of textile, because, you know, we can talk about that medium, but to talk about the equivalence between texture, textile, and cinema, basically, to actually talk about that continuum. Some kind of continuum from, actually, I should say, textile to texture to cinema. Another thing that's important to us is the notion of art as a community of those who can be moved, or those who are willing to be moved, those who are willing to feel something, but also art as a community of changing subtexts. In other words, what things mean is not fixed and is not something that is set in stone by the artist alone. That's something that very much happens also in the minds of viewers and in a larger discourse bar in some sense. And sometimes in our experience it's necessary to retreat from things meaning overtly something that's readable immediately in order to express something that is a little bit harder to express, that is a little bit harder to bring out. And in that sense, I think that work with abstraction as one of the components, poetry as one of the other components, is when you compare that to mainstream ideas about how to tell a story, there is some tension between that and the notion of realism versus abstraction, of course, and, you know, narrative as opposed to poetry. And in cinema, of course, especially, we see that there has been some sort of break where poetic cinema was, I wouldn't say completely sidelined, but it was definitely marginalized as opposed to, you know, narrative and then mainstream, you know, industry cinema. So the reason I'm showing film stills as well is because for us these are intimately connected to our textile works as well. So there's a film still from Chaos Theory from 2021. It's actually a film about parenting, something that is a subject matter that is not necessarily the first subject matter that is talked about in contemporary art. This is what I mean by using abstraction, or using the capacity to navigate between texture and cinema, or narrative and poetry, as a way to bring out things you want to express, things that are necessary for one to express. We talk about cinema, not about video, because there is a certain texture in moving image that definitely belongs to the heritage of, you know, celluloid film, and not so much to the heritage of the video, you know, sensing chip. And we can talk about that more, but it's not necessary for now. It's just meant to explain what we do and also a certain why we do it. So I think one of the reasons why, you know, the graphic design field that we originate from does not always present the challenges that we need is because the question of an internal necessity to do what you do and to sort of find out why you're doing it is sort of less present in a field where an outside incentive is always the center point of attention. So whereas, you know, graphic design as a field is appreciated sometimes in the art world and sometimes shown in an equivalence to art, I do think that art and design have very separate ontologies and very separate reasons to exist. And that's also something we appreciate through conversations with artists that we have at, amongst other places, Rijksacademie in Amsterdam. Right, so I don't want this to be about, let's say, everything we do, and I'm showing only a very small section of what we do, but I think it's necessary to give a little bit of context here in the discourse bar, which is itself connected to a small solo by Flaka in the other two rooms, which you can, if you have not seen it yet, go see it. I think when Flaka's invitation arrived, actually it arrived first through Sophie. We're aware of Flaka's work very much. But it's always, and especially in the sort of post-COVID era, like a real sort of not even a privilege, but like a sort of luxury to meet in person and talk about things that are not through Instagram or through interfaces, but in a real conversation. And what we, so I think that we feel a lot of for Flaka's work and also a sense of recognition. I think also what became apparent to us is that we are in love with something that is not categorizable within a disciplinary framework. So I'm not so much talking about that work is, you know, video or textile or design, but that the raison d'être of the work or the kind of background of the work or the way that the work is made is not categorizable. And there is, of course, a category of the uncategorizable, but I think we can zoom in a little bit more on abstraction, categories, these types of things, as we also go to Flaka very soon, which will be in the next 10 seconds, or 9 seconds, or 8, or 7 seconds. So here we can definitely talk about texture and text, which obviously writing is also something we love doing. And I can talk more about the films, but we won't do that. 4, 3, 2, 1, lift off. Thank you. Do you want the...
I guess, yeah.
Shall we do this?
Okay, I will pick up where you left regarding the how this collaboration started. But before that, I would just like to introduce you my recent work, which is just like a month old, for Manifesta 14, which was opened in July 22nd in Pristina. And somehow this artwork connects very well to the aesthetics and the language and things happening here. And maybe that's a departure, and this is more like kind of expanding or extension. And so I thought maybe I gave you that background, and then we continue to the next step. So let me just go here to this image. It's just a screenshot from my Instagram. But I wanted to show you this element here. You see these windows. This is a military camp of NATO, German camp in Pristina. And I was exhibiting in Autostrada Bano, where this is my work. And this work also somehow generates with a discarded object found from military camps of NATO in Kosovo. But while doing this, I noticed this light entering always as a kind of a graphic element, solar effect in my pictures. Okay, I'm not used anymore to use this kind of computer. So how do I go back? What?
Want to close?
Yes. How can I open all of them? Like. You see closer here this light situation, and another one here. So it's very strong, and it's weird because I was not realizing this in the space, only on my pictures, after I realized how this enters somehow in a frame. And then I asked the guys, the organizers, what is it? How is this happening? And they said, yeah, it's these plastic windows. We have to change it because they are burned out of the sun for 20 years now that they have been there. So usual condition of material would be just like matte plastic, you know, opaque. And now it has this effect if the light comes from outside. So he said, we have to change it, so renew with a new one. And I asked him, 10 minutes later, I walked around and my brain just started to work. And then I came back and I said, can you save it for me? And then they got really excited, so they did it. So, but I didn't know when and how I'm going to use. When Manifesta curator asked me to be part of the show, her story was how to, basically her concept was how to tell stories otherwise. And this question for me was so clear that there is certain kind of story embedded on this material, inscribed in 20 years, how the sun burned it and left certain kind of traces. So it's a kind of witness of time, you know? And especially when you think in a military context, what happened with Kosovo case, 20 years of presence of NATO there, what happened, there's so less story to tell, you know? So I decided to take those plastics. So now you see the plastics are all these 10 boxes where when you don't have the light from back, they just look like burned plastic, brown. And so I decided to create certain kind of uncanny horizon as a under construction in a way because of the scaffolding. And it was placed in a Palace of Youth in Pristina on top of the building. And on the night, the lights start getting inside on the box, which was installed, start almost having the same effect what they had in an actual room. And there you see also the military, the same kind of pattern. What I thought was missing, the kind of juxtaposition of the third element that create relation to military aesthetics, because Kosovo had like 50,000 troops entering after the bombing, which means one can try to understand how big was the spatial presence of military, you know, from vehicles to camp to soldiers' presence and so on. To go through 20 years of after the war, one has to think a lot how much this country needs to demilitarize in that sense, the aesthetics and everything that comes as a story or shadow it. And so the military, now, then you see this cut out, what you see also here, and from the pattern, becomes actually a cloud. And it has this kind of temporality because in the daylight the work looks much lighter, though it works very well also with the architecture of the buildings, but still it gets much more kind of darker in a sense because one can question if this horizon is glowing or is burning. So it's like kind of between past and future. Let me close it here. I had the drone filming just to give a little bit more, so you see now the whole architecture around it. It was really slow, trying to go.
What are the buildings you see?
This is the Palace of Youth, built in 1975. For me, it was very difficult to be in this building. I kind of tried to refuse. It was not my first choice, because the other thing is when you are in such an iconic building, one has to think, how do you create a dialogue with something that is so strong in itself? You know, does it kill the work, or does the work has enough respect to kind of create enough aesthetic dialogue that doesn't, you know, violate what you see? And from the distance and many ways how the aesthetic works was really, I could say, I was happy in the end. Because it also finds a way to camouflage with the elements that repeats with verticality and the dark and these stripes and lines and this was maybe on the, no, that's just an image. on the night when the opening was happening, basically. Yeah, so now you have a little bit of two works connection here between this one and that. And to go back to the invitation I made for Metahaven and then also I expanded to Marcus Meeson, was for me important because since my class was a lot dealing with the question of identity or disidentity in relation to what are the agencies around if there's a hybrid practice. So if you are in an in-betweenness, if you're like kind of not defined, but you are between this specificity and this specificity, and you're none of them, but you're both maybe, and what agency that has, like in relation to also how the art categorization are made, how those representations are always taking more value and having more space in the art market or in art history, and so on and so on. So those questions, what we are trying to understand in my class last year and more also specifically this year, when Sophie asked me to do the show, I thought I actually need to do something that becomes an in-between space. And the title, Just Barely, Possibly, Maybe, somehow also refers to this kind of potentiality of becomingness. So the state of becomingness as a constant state of movement, as a kind of a queer momentum. That's like Jose Munoz says, we are not yet queer. So the being queer means like to not be yet queer, so the constant becomeness. And so in this case, to think about this just barely, possibly, maybe, is this an exhibition space? Is this a discursive bar? Is this an artwork or not? You know, so where does the artwork start and ends, and how far this is a bar and this is, you know, a leaning or a table or a cloud, or, you know, so there are many questions, and how also the shapes and forms somehow, even if they look solid, they're not stated as solid in their agency, so to say. And when I speak often about this topic, since it has a lot to do with questions I try to answer in my artwork, people ask me, but are there other positions who are like this? And then becomes a very tricky question, because then you don't know really if you're allowed even to say it, because there comes this moment when you're like, am I now too pretentious to compare myself to another position? Or am I maybe going to misunderstand this position? You know, maybe this position doesn't want me to project this thing. So you out of respect, but out of also you start to kind of struggle if you can just say, yeah, I know this people thinking the same way, you know? So that is another moment, kind of conflictual position as well, you know? Because you kind of start again to define somebody. And in going back to Metahaven, I knew, okay, that's a kind of position I think avoids categorization in many ways. Knowing your background, where you come from with the graphic design and how far you went with all kind of different, being part, or as you said once, being on the edge of different fields, but never taking the center. You know, and this was for me so interesting, because by not being on the center, you already lose certain kind of rights, certain kind of agencies for representation, because phallomorphism, like the Western phallomorphism, is about trying to define things in order to give a value. And that's a moment when we enter in a certain kind of crisis with the national identities, because they're so similar ways of functioning with the territories, with how a flag should be, be very special, but in the end, many of the flags look same, you know, but they still aim to make a unique flag or something, or the animal quoted national animal symbols, for example. How many wants to have eagle as their own identity animal? But in the end, many countries have the eagle too. So then they try to make it specific by making a different shape of that eagle in order to say, yeah, but our eagle has two heads and our eagle has this way of standing. So, you know, like trying to go in a deeper way of making things defined in order to make it unique and claim certain kind of right for representation, you know. And this is very problematic because that means if you're visible, if you're defined, you have a right to be represented, and if you have a voice, and if you have a right to be represented, means you have you exist as political entity, and that is the problem. Which means that at certain point you need to be visible in order to become a political entity voice, and this kind of definition more and more we try to challenge through hybridity, opacity, detour, and all kind of, you know, strategies in art, which we think could be now the queer way of thinking, goes on conflict with the way still how market works, how art history canon works, and how many things still we give values. So those are questions what I thought would be interesting to try and answer more and more in my class, and I hope my students going to have questions and comments. They're very smart. And yeah.
Maybe, Dania, you want to go first in response to what Flaka said and the way she also reads you.
Yeah, well, like I'm somebody who always tries to be as concrete as possible. So my first inclination is to respond to the Manifesta piece. Okay. So is less about positions or about the story you're telling, and more about the piece itself. Because I think, like, I'm not an art historian, not an art critic, of course, but I think that the piece, what I love about it is that it brings in a sort of commemoration that is completely antithetical to the type of aesthetics and also narratives that we normally would receive from a place like Kosovo, basically. Like, I'm still remembering that I was weeping over the PJ Harvey video that was recorded in Kosovo because it's like so moving. Yeah. But you also realize you can almost tick the boxes. There's a rusty Soviet era playground. There's like, you know, there's like birds circling around some kind of military artifact. There's like the Bill Clinton billboard, like faded, you know. And I thought that was actually the first object that I thought about when I saw that. I was like, where's Bill Clinton? Has been taken out of his frame in a way, you know, like, and replaced by this, you know, this thing that looks a little bit like a sort of solar panel from the Middle Ages or something. I'm not the Middle Ages, but definitely a kind of solar panel that is not a solar panel. And we have a great relationship with solar panels, as you saw in video stills.
There is a solar relation to
yeah,
it.
yeah.
So the aesthetics of
yeah.
all the sunburn and this plastic.
Yeah, so it also has this sort of scaffolding feeling and something being sort of under construction, so even celebrational in a certain way, but in a sort of abstract way. So it doesn't give the kind of like, it's not a reinvestigation of like murals, social realist murals or anything. It really doesn't go there. I think I like that a lot about it.
But the construction is also for me this becomeness as a horizon in a process of becoming.
Yeah, but at some point the piece also is something. So it's like, it's not, that's maybe what we always confront is that the things are not always becoming, that at some point they're like, they're what they are.
They first have to be something and then become more, like, you know, of course. Yeah. You can't, the becomeness is not to underestimate, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think it's also putting us in some theoretical waters, maybe, connected to that.
Becomeness could connect to that, what you said. You don't close the work in relation to what you as an author thought. So you find ways to open up for the reader to add and make the work further develop, you know.
I think that when I was in art school, I could never finish any work that I did. I could just not finish it. So at the end, like end of year crit, you had all these, oh, this was actually meant to be this. This was halfway there, going there.
Yeah.
So for me, like being able to finish something is very good for me, actually, if I just talk for myself, because it means I've overcome that inability to finish something, or starting up too many ideas at the same time. But I think that...
But at the same time, you said your work is always from one point brings you to the next production. So that's actually become...
But that's so iterating, iterative in a sense.
It doesn't close with that series or...
Yeah, well, it's like every film, you know, that you do, for example, is in some sense a success, and in every film is in its own sense a failure, in the sense that you feel like, oh, it opened up this question, but the film could not answer that question because it was something that was opened up. So you need to make a next film. Yeah. And at some point you need to sort of like make a decision about that cycle, how you're going to be in that cycle. You can't go on doing that forever. You need to, you know, either... So, for example, we talk a lot about mainstream filmmaking as the way that we don't want to work. And one film that for me exemplifies that is Tenet by Christopher Nolan. That exemplifies everything that we think film should not be, in the sense of that it wants to be Casino Royale and Stalker at the same time. You know, it wants to be a deep philosophical piece about physics, and on the other hand, it wants to be a sort of blockbuster James Bond film. And you end up with all these threads that have to make sense. And there is a big argument to be made for not making sense, I think, in some work. Yeah. But let's say talking to this, you know, idea of the in-between and the idea of the marginal, I think that there's many ways in which our practices are not marginal, neither yours nor ours, because we come from places that are still centers in terms of like the resources available, the fact that we could study art, you know, the fact that our families found that okay. I'm not sure about how your family responded to you doing art. It was a long story. So maybe it's different for you, but I think that is something that we need to acknowledge, that we still do come from that sort of center, quote unquote, which is not a center, and it doesn't deserve to be a center always. But I do feel that making work that then amplifies that is sort of not the interesting thing to do. Like we grew up in a time when something called Dutch design was a thing. And it meant that certain furniture design, basically everything that you can rubricize under Dutch design, you don't need in an emergency. You only need it in a situation of luxury, like a chair that costs 5,000, 10,000 euros, or like a certain way of doing graphic design that embodies certain values or ideas that we think are embedded in an element, but they're just a style sheet basically applied to some content, you know? And I think that thinness felt, of course, didn't identify with at all. So we started to say, no, we don't want to do graphic design, we want to do research. And in 2004, when we started our first project together, and at the time it was not a common thing to say in like a design field, to speak like that. So if you say something like that, it must be for what was called exposure or self, you know, to put yourself in the center. But actually design is not, or art is not about that. Art is much more sponge-like, much more about absorption and about ways in which things made in a certain time become accounts of their time. So in that sense, I do feel that this piece in Kosovo is very much about the sponge. It's very much about being this kind of public testimony. That's why I thought the story about you seeing these windows in at NATO headquarters and saying like, we're going to get rid of them. No, actually, can you maybe give them to me? Maybe just barely, possibly, maybe. Can I have them? Is a great story. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I forgot to mention, the title of the work is Under the Sun, Explain What Happened. Because this timing that passed by somehow, I thought there's still somebody, we still have to reflect whose responsibility was that there is so less of development of the country after the war. And speaking with Marina, we were saying that maybe NATO is good on stopping a war, but not good enough to develop a country after the war. So this stagnation of time, it is so important to question the status quo, that nothing really moves forward, but nothing goes, you know? So there's something stuck. And so Under the Sun explain what happened. As poetic as it sounds, the first part, Under the Sun, then explain what happened. It's interrogating, which has this kind of military way of putting into question and responsibility. Is it over? Shall we go home?
It's over when you say it's over, you know what I mean? But anyway, we should take some questions now from the audience, yeah?
Thank you very much for this, very enlightening. Because I've been in discussion exactly this last point of NATO and how the intervention has double-faced. I think hearing also speaking, and it was great also the discourse bar, but also this work, it was very interesting for me that you mentioned in the end about its military identity and its sort of somehow identity. I think I wanted to ask a little bit about this hybrid position that you are saying, that it's a very interesting point, but nowadays can be also taken, as you said, a little bit from another point. Also the same, when we say art should be about that, it's also from where viewpoint we're speaking. Art shouldn't be about this or that. Art could be this, could be that, could be this and the other. So for me, the hybrid is kind of important. Like recently we saw a lot of people fighting for bringing back their identity, sort of national identity, gender identity, very much up front. But also that has has side effects. You know, we also see a lot of fascistic governments being fortified around Europe and other places. So it's very double-faced. So what about this hybrid position? If you can say a few words more on where you find yourself there, in the arts, in the world, in the being, you know.
My era in the art history is mine. And funny enough, you say something about mannerism when it comes to creating certain kind of pattern of repeating in your artistic practice, you know? Okay. And that's how that becomes manneristic, you say. So what is funny about mannerism is that it's this in-betweeners between high Renaissance. So some call it high Renaissance, and some call it mannerism. And then comes the Baroque, you know. And then you try to analyze a little bit, read about it. What is this? Because in a school I was doing in Pristina, first art history encounter, our professor was so conservative and he said, this is the part where everything was destroyed. From all the perfection of Renaissance, this art history was like degenerate, you know, like something went wrong, and then Baroque came and fixed it or made it defined and was clear what it is. So this unclearness of what it is, this period, was interesting because actually art history is born in manneristic moment. So meaning like the self-criticality of what you're doing and reflecting to your practice happened exactly on that time. The art historian who did that was also a painter, you know, Vasali was. So this is a kind of things what gives you some ideas why actually those are the, you know, coincidence or not. Going back to why I'm struggling with certain kind of, you know, in a system, though I'm represented because I have exhibitions, I also teaching and so on. but to what degree one can be, because hybridity is also about being misunderstood, being not defined. Being not defined, if you're misunderstood, means it can be easy to be misunderstood, but the challenge is to be represented by being misunderstood, as like Glissant, when he talks about opacity, you know, which is political right and ethical, you know, kind of. So in this case, for me, hybridity entered as a practice, as more like how I operate, you know, and less illustrating in the artwork. In the work might be an element where it still does that, you know, but it's also how I decide which work I'm going with, what materials and when and for which exhibition, and how I deal in relation to market and so on and so on. And how far I am disturbed position for many people who can't define me, and how far that kind of misunderstanding irritates also the writers, the collectors, and so on. Why? Because when it comes to how I understood, basically, that the art, if we go with theory of being the difference and repetition from Deleuze, means you can start with that every artist wants to bring something unique in the world, you know, and that uniqueness has to be repeat in order to enter in a system, to be accepted. And so that repetition, it's actually then this claim, what the artist claims as a gesture, my style, my way of doing the repetition, you know, and this manneristic pattern maybe. And so then what happened often is that the curators or the writers coin that gesture. And often they say, yeah, I was the first one who gave the solo show to the artist and made it very clear about this position, you know? And then comes to the collector and market who gives value to that gesture by buying that. And often I see that many collectors have a problem to buy my work because they don't know which of my work is actually represent my practice. Which one of my work is exactly my gesture, more amplified or something, you know? So those are then, when you see how the agency, where you lose that, but what do you have to change? There is still so much to discover by it. Did I answer?
Yes.
And I think Daniel probably can
add
confront
something.
me here.
Not actually, no, I think it's great to involve the audience or to involve everybody. Yeah.
But I guess the question of hybridity is very much part of your practice. In the sense also how, I said at the beginning, you kind of shifted from a certain, let's say, design approach to different kind of visualities.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But you don't feel like...
Well, I mean, hybridity, I think it is a sort of vulnerability in a way, but it's also a way to keep things interesting for oneself. I mean, the thing that Flaka is sketching out of artists that are obliged to basically repeat themselves endlessly in their body of work, that replacing the research process or the process of like discovery is a very important point that you just made. And I feel that uncategorizable work emerges when the artist takes weird turns that are not so much pure rejections of, because we are familiar with the idea of that we reject the past to do something else, but they're not necessarily rejecting everything that came before, but it's just part of that sort of iterative path of not fixing something to the extent that it becomes iconic and then becomes that one thing that stands for. And then, you know, the question that you confront is how does this work withstand, how does this work, how are you able to actually summarize these works? You know, because at some point you're going to need to make something very compact. You know, what is actually going to remain is something very compact, whether we like it or not. It's not going to be distributed and hybrid, but it's going to be some sort of core of something. And in that sense, I think we cannot escape talking about why art is made, why we do art, why do we even call it art? Why not call it just object, or just industrial? Like, why not? We can give different names to this thing without, but it's art. The only thing that can really explain why it is what it is art. So I do feel that there's also that notion of what community do we talk to when we make what we do, because I think that we do it also in relation to people, no? We don't, or an audience maybe, or others in the most general sense. I think that is something that should be present, or that should be mentioned. It's not that our work is straight going from artist to curator, or going straight from artist to collector. There is, it should be something for lots of others. Yeah.
Hi. I have a comment and then a question. The comment is that in the manifesto there was also work from Petrit Halilech, and it's also about landscape and the sun in a way. But I see your work more like a resistor, like a photograph. I see these burned plastics as photographs, like you said. And I see his works more like, your work is a register camouflated on the landscape, and his work is more optimist, because I think the translation is something like, when the light of the sun rises,
when the light goes down, when
paint.
the light goes away, when the sun goes away, we paint the sky.
Yeah.
And then it's the stars, what he has from the Hotel Grand stars.
So it feels optimistic because it has some direction into a future, and you are. I like this relation between both works in the manifest. That was the comment.
Yeah, that's an interesting read, because obvious was his building was also on top and just opposite, but it's why for me the poetics needs to be a counter poetic. It's like when something, a desire to express becomes impossible to express, confronts something impossible to express. So as a like, in a way, when one part says under the sun, explain what happened, for me adds to critical position I want to have my work to place it. I don't want my work to be like, there's this optimistic, yay, I want the work to be there for two ways. There is some optimism there because the camouflage is becoming a cloud. The discarded object, which is present, eminent, but doesn't exist on the present tense, and then suddenly becomes present tense, becomeness, and becomeness is hope. So there are more indirect way of understanding where this optimism relies, but with some kind of critical voice, adding to it and questioning in order to reflect a little bit to the status quo. Because Kosovo case, it is not only, oh yeah, let's dream. Did we dream till now? What happened? And also, thank you for this, because that helps me to explain further my way of working,
And the question was about this exhibition. I see you both work with the illustration from figurative elements, like what I'm seeing here. And they both mutate to other forms. So it feels like nature is a projection surface for political issues. Is that a point that you come together here, or how you see your collaboration in this space?
I need to save my voice.
Yeah. At a strategic moment. Yeah. Yeah. No, for sure. Like, no, sure. Like, I think that the notion of like, so if you introduce if you think about art in purely figurative terms, then I mean, we know that that doesn't really work, right? Because you are going to run into issues that that are not super interesting, basically, to confront. So I think that the question that I have is much more a question about the intimacy that certain visual form making can, enable with viewers. So for us, living together in stories is about transformative capacity of narrative and about how we need to construct these narratives, whether we like it or not, in order to construct worlds for ourselves. And now that you talk about this, I do notice that both bodies of work engage with the kind of morphing, or the kind of like morphing of nature form and sort of stretching and like, which are basically abilities that we have in part because of our imagination, but also because of certain digital tools, right? So I think you're talking about a point where something starts to edge towards painting, but doesn't become painting completely, or it starts to edge towards sculpture or 3D animation, but it doesn't go there completely. Just barely. I think there's also a notion where when we think about stretching something, that it immediately becomes connected to this kind of really slick, that whatever you stretch becomes kind of slick and shiny or something. And you can also think about that not being the case. You can also think about the stretching as something that is actually much more soft and that is connected to an experience that's much more like a blanket, hence these. Yeah, so the idea of wrapping was also very important, the idea of that you could sort of wrap yourself into it. But I mean, I have to say that the invitation came also not super, like the notice was quite short, so we immediately responded by, okay, this is what we're gonna do, because we knew that if we're not starting now, we're not gonna be able to actually produce. So had we had more time to actually conceive of everything, we probably would have integrated things more or whatever, or maybe that's something for the next iteration. Yeah. So there was a time pressure involved on some level. Yeah.
Oh, with time pressure, it's also interesting for me, all kind of conditions, including space, budget, time, those are ways to maybe they kind of limits you, but that's the moment why we are an artist, that we have to be creative. And if we can't come up with something in that kind of dynamic, then we don't always work in commodity. Give me the time, give me the budget I need, give me the, all kind of things, because what would be that? I don't know. But for me, those limits, producing something, coming up with a gesture which already makes certain kind of statement. And then the title of Just Barely Possibly Maybe, which we discussed a lot, in the end for me was a lot about this possibility of stretch, how far this stretch can still be stretched, and where is the moment that this stretch becomes something,
It's maybe not a question, but just a comment. When you were talking about the construction of identity, and for example, for a nation, how when a nation is born and is like started to create a symbol like a flag, and you mention all the symbolism that is embedded in a flag, like, I don't know, power and strength, and how that is become very recognizable symbol. And everybody in a population that is like sharing those symbols can recognize and identify, and there is all this process of identification. And then also the spreading of it, and somehow it is encoded in those symbols, color, that material that is used and then is spread around and is in a sort of ritual. And somehow I was thinking how this work is also coded. There are codes in it, and somehow we can recognize something, but also it moves. So this becoming that you mentioned, it also makes you uncomfortable somehow, because it uses certain tropes that we can recognize maybe that are used in power. For example, also just the fact that it has a structure from a billboard, but actually is not communicating directly something we can recognize. Or like the clouds, but they are also coming from camouflage, or they are coming anyway from, again, this big history of also militarization, and now we use natural environment and to then transform it into something useful and exploitative for the army and for the military. And then again, the sun, somehow it's of course not natural. There is something that puts you in an uncomfortable position. It can be also related with something nuclear, so not, or maybe even a solar panel, but there is something we recognize, but we don't recognize. And I think that creates an uncomfortable position from a spectator, but it also is the position of questioning, because it disidentify, but you still recognize something. So that's just a comment. And in Daniel, in relation to the stories, so we started with this tapestry. I don't know if you call it tapestry or blanket, but somehow this jacquard textile. And now I was thinking actually in the class we discussed how jacquard textile is an encoding. So how the story is encoded into actually a system that it comes, for example, from a technology and is also the first computer, somehow the first process. And how that is really embedded and somehow it kind of creates a story in itself. But of course, textile goes over this also by having a texture, and here you create other forms with it and other surfaces with it. And I wanted maybe if you speak more about this idea of stories. You also mentioned cinema and this becoming in cinema this sort of constructed, but again, you mentioned surface, so the materiality of it. So it's not only, let's say, a montage, so the create a story through a montage, but you again emphasize this materiality of the story. Yeah,
I think that's a super nice one to. Do you want to respond first, or there? Okay, can I put up? No, maybe I can. I think if I talk about I can show an example, or I can just talk. That's
as you wish. We can try.
Okay. Well, I mean, yeah. Okay. So, what I think is important, like you're saying something very important about jacquard. So you're talking about the computer code and textile code and weaving as being equivalent technologies is super true. There's actually the Uzbekistan pavilion in the Venice Biennial is about coders and weavers. So it's all about that. And I think that at some point, we realized that within our practice and within the idea of graphic design, there is actually nothing anymore that keeps you from making something look exactly as you want it to look. There's actually no friction anymore between intent and outcome. You can basically design a font so detailed that you don't have this friction anymore. I think in textile work there is still a form of friction involved in the sense that what you create, even though you do create it on a computer and it gets translated into a jacquard, there is some element of that as if you put something in the oven and you put a dish in the oven and you're like, I hope it's going to taste great, but I don't know. And there is that element of that you actually involve a factor that you don't completely control. I think with regard to texture, I think that we started out, and that was also educationally where we came from, with the idea that the whole world that we have is full of found footage. And all of that footage, meaning video material, is on YouTube. So we can download everything, we can build every possible story based with these things. Until we discover that YouTube compresses everything that it has into a certain format, which means that you lose the texture that characterized the original media. And in that sense, we started to think much more about media as objects and about the objecthood of films, and not so much as pieces of content that could take on any form and that could stream in every type of format. So meaning also that the artist, that an artwork, like a cinematic artwork, is a distinct object from something that's on YouTube or from something that's compressed or streamed, in one way or another. And we should not get too fundamentalist about that, because that means that you can't show anything anymore at some point. But there is a way in which texture captures the origin story of a piece of material, and it also contains information about that story. It's not that it's just the content. No, the surface is part of the content. And working with that element in the kind of, which is distinct from montage and is more associated with post, bringing the post into the stage of editing and even pre-production is something that we love, because that involves the notion of texture. And we see that in the notion of filming something, creating scenes that you film, and the unpredictability that you introduce by not being able to control that is very equivalent to the unpredictability that exists in textiles, even though they're pretty controlled. The larger they are, the more controlled they look. I mean, there's some smaller ones that are like tiny, tiny, and they are actually, I think they're glitchier or something. They're just less sort of like, they're less fluid in a way, yeah. Does that answer the question a bit? Yeah. Great. Thank you.
I can take it over for the comments, because it's interesting that you said makes the viewer uncomfortable, right? Yeah. And that there is something familiar on it and there is something abstracted at the same time. So this familiarity between the form and the aesthetic, this common sense of what we recognize, how far that can be abstracted, but why to abstract it? So if we abstract something, we also understand that the abstraction makes space for what is not represented on a familiar form, So that brings us to the uncanniness, what I said. There is some kind of uncanny horizon, which is also what Glissant says. The uncanniness is about a truth that was suppressed and wants to come out, and then when it comes out, it's uncanny, And once was a normative, once was part of acceptness, And that brings me again to this other part of, uncomfortable, because it has in between us again, if this sunset is glowing or if it's burning. It has two ways to look. One is optimistic and one is, not as much. So again, brings you into this past and future temporality, And again, the abstraction for me in relation to using the ready-made and putting them in dialogue, it's a bit like appropriation and abrogation in the system. One that makes adaptation of the systematic order, and the other refuses to do so,
Can I jump in on that?
Please.
So you talk about the kind of idea of sort of minor or major scale almost, right? Or like the dystopia, utopia, or you talk about the glass half full or half empty. Yeah. And I feel like
it's just this in-betweenness, allows you to question it and position yourself.
Yeah, but I think that there is so much. It's so important to think about the glass. I'm maybe going to contradict you now a little bit, if you like. Maybe we'll have a slight disagreement even. I think that making the glass half full. I feel that the dystopian is the preset. So everything is already sort of set to be read in that.
How about heterotopic?
What?
Well, how about heterotopic?
Of course, yeah, I know. We shouldn't talk, but you introduced these two scales.
But heterotopia is about the more varieties or more ways of being.
True. In terms of a place, what were the examples of heterotopias? Schools?
Systems,
things like that, yeah. Yeah, okay, but I feel that the notion of the by default dystopia is something that we need to counter. Maybe it's something that's still a little bit associated with the... Here we can also talk about cinema, in fact, because cinema played a big role in that. Yeah. And especially yeah.
But if you really try to understand, you would know that I'm in a glass full, Because if you think of the cloud getting out of the military and becoming a cloud,
sure.
there is a demilitarization of aesthetics already happening, or some discarded object becoming a.
Sure. I was not trying to categorize you as a dystopian camp, but there is ways in which also a demand of certain framing practices is that the work is about geopolitics, or the work needs to be about who knows what. And in order for it to be about that, it needs to have, bombastic, aesthetic, whatever, which I think we should not affirm.
Yeah, but I'm very aware when I say uncanniness, because uncanny sounds so easy to say for something like a Grinch or whatever. But when I say uncanny, I thought of that, I thought exactly what kind of, irritation or uncomfortable feeling might bring to the viewer this kind of aesthetic or this kind of dialogue on language between familiarity and abstraction,
And also future.
As a,
future has this kind of expectation or not, so when you bring it in, and it's in the work, so because it's not only about the past, but it really moves. No, it was not a comment. Okay, I say that is because in the last you mentioned future, and I think it's very important because in the work there is that, and that also comes with this uncanniness.
Yeah.
And so that idea that so what is this? Is about what is coming, or so it's coming from somewhere, but also it goes somewhere. So it's again in movement. It doesn't stop and say, this is what we are. It doesn't define that.
Yeah.
Well, I think we should come to some kind of, not conclusion. No, there's one more.
I'm still trying to think how to formulate this question, but how are these ideas or narratives, which are essentially human forms of the narrative, how are they influencing or existing in an ecosystem outside the human perception? That is to say, how does the artist, which creates artworks or narratives, how do those ideas maybe affect the non-human? And if it does have any effect, and I was also thinking how you were saying about not making sense, but at the same time how the human language is based on making sense, and how from
the human language is based on sounds.
Sounds.
So it's like it's become sense making when it starts to be integrated into language systems, but the core components are not necessarily sense making. But I think your question about communication, basically, and about commensurability is a very pertinent one. I think that from my side, I'm not necessarily always the believer in the most obvious ways of art projects that address the non-human, because I feel that these projects sometimes are designed to show to humans that we are addressing the non-human, but they're not necessarily created to really deal with that question of commensurability. But I think that if you think about how things like cognition, sensing, sentience in the broader sense are being, not just in the art world, but more broadly, also scientifically being unlocked as being far more complex and diverse topics than how they were treated by, let's say, mainstream science for the last sort of decades or whatever. I think there's so much there. I think that it's not only that the non-human or animals or non-human beings are not necessarily commensurable with our art, but that we are not commensurable with their art. That is also an issue.
And why do you see a separation?
Well, I mean that, for example, take the example of whale vocalization, for example. That is an example of animals producing a very elaborate form of vocalization that is on some levels not explicitly, because the obvious thing that happens with whale vocalization is that the biologists try to explain it out of evolutionary motives. There is basically straight, like evolutionary interest in having a great song or something. And then it turns out that this is not completely the case. There's ways in which whale vocalization does not correspond to these, expectations that are the most obvious Darwinistic explanation. I think at that point, we can say that an art-related explanation becomes within reach, in a way, because we can't explain it away on an evolutionary platform. We need to think about other ways why this vocalization exists. There have been measurements on the bit rate of whale vocalization, which turns out that there's, well, if you talk purely about the bit rate measurement, it says that it's language, or it could be language. So here we are talking about the beginning of some form of potential commensurability, where that starts to emerge, in which we need to go down from our platform, or maybe up from our platform, but we need to leave the platform by which we understand what the message is, by which we understand what something beautiful might be, by which we are conditioned to look at things, to completely, go somewhere else. And I think we have a great bond here with, the idea of a broader idea of cognitive science, or a broader idea of cognitive philosophy as a companion for art practice. So the fact is that non-humans are not addressed by, I think, the works we talked about today, but the thinking about the way in which we create commensurability with someone else or something else is part of the ontology of these artworks. That was a very long answer, I'm sorry.
Is there more questions? Or?
Maybe a final question, but there's one more? Yeah, okay, one more.
Yes, so you both mentioned that you kind of work with textual works, and I think, it's not synonymous to poetry, but of course, like the basis of it is textual, but kind of more abstracted in a way. And I was wondering, in your work, Flaka, I really noticed that there was a title of a work, and then it was kind of repeated also physically in the work. And somehow that really intrigues me, because when I see a title of a work, it has a really different standpoint, and when it reappears in a work, then it makes me think about the difference of them, kind of the contrast in them. And when you speak about this hybridity, I think when it shows up in more figurative or abstract work, text is like really symbolic and concrete somehow. So it creates this like really drastic difference, and like what's in between the title, which is printed next to a work, and then this text that shows up on a surface, basically.
About different examples, or are you suggesting when is it, or you know example from my work when the text is actually in the work?
Yes, that's what I mean in your.
Okay. The way I treat the whole body of the work, I treat it as some kind of unity. That there is a concept, let's say, the starting point of a story, and then comes the aesthetics. Often could be chicken and egg situation, but those two. Then one is highly, conceptual, orientated, trying to make sense, tell a proper, tell some story or build up a story, while the aesthetics are this kind of form that wants to as equally conquer the concept in relation to who comes first and what's more important. Because I come from conceptual approach, from where I started. But then I studied in Städelschule, where aesthetics were formalism was so strong that this helped me to create a balance between the two. And then comes PhD in practice, what I started, and I didn't finish in academy, where actually theory enters from another angle and almost creates a disbalance of the other two and makes the concept less banal, less direct, less closing, or creating enclosure, but it also makes the aesthetics in a way less superficial, less being, this is, I just do this because I really like this form. No, so the theory creates again in between a sort of dialogue between the two. And what the title does, decenter the materiality, decenter the whole thing between the work and the title, and you think, without that title, could it still work, or is the title that relativizes the object, And I have had people who said, making a title for you, it's like making an artwork. And that could be yes and no, because everything about my artwork is yes and no. It's not really.
I think there's tentatively a yes to continue this
just barely,
conversation
possibly, maybe.
informally. But before we go into another kind of beautiful summer evening, I would like to announce our next event this week, Crossing number 10, The Empress, with Jennifer Hickey. And Jennifer Hickey is a writer, art critic, and the co-founder of Freeze Art Magazine. And she will introduce her book, The Mirror and the Palette, 500 Years of Women's Self-Portraits. So next Wednesday at 7 p.m. we meet here again. Thank you very much for coming, also those who joined us online. And thank you, Flaka and Daniel, for the kind of in-betweenness in this conversation. Thank you.